The restaurant went silent the moment he walked in, the kind of silence that follows power. Everyone knew who he was, the Mafia boss. But tonight, he wasn't here for business. He was here with his father, an older man with calm eyes and quiet hands, a man who had lost his hearing years ago. The staff froze, unsure how to greet him, except for one. A shy waitress stepped forward, her hands trembling as she placed the menu down, and then, instead of speaking, she signed. The old man looked up, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. No one had spoken to him in his language in years. Across the table, the Mafia boss's face changed. The look in his eyes went from guarded to something no one had ever seen before. That night, the entire restaurant witnessed something unforgettable, a moment that would change both of their lives forever. Stay with me until the end, because this story will warm your heart in ways you don't expect. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Bella's Ristorante had been serving the finest Italian cuisine in Little Italy for over 40 years. The mahogany walls held decades of memories, whispered conversations, and celebrations that stretched late into the night. But on this particular evening, the atmosphere carried something different, something electric. Maria Santos had been working there for exactly 3 months. At 22, she was still learning the ropes of fine dining service. Her manager, Giuseppe, had hired her despite her obvious nervousness during the interview. Maybe it was her genuine smile, or perhaps the way she carefully studied the wine list like it was scripture. Whatever it was, she'd earned her place among the seasoned waitstaff. What Giuseppe didn't know was that Maria carried a secret, a skill she'd never mentioned on her application, something she'd learned not by choice, but by necessity. Her younger brother had been born deaf, and from the age of 8, Maria had become fluent in American Sign Language. It wasn't just communication for her family, it was survival, connection, love expressed through movement and gesture. The evening started like any other Tuesday. The usual regulars occupied their favorite tables, the kitchen hummed with practiced efficiency, and Maria moved between her assigned section with growing confidence. She'd finally stopped dropping silverware and could balance 3 plates without breaking into a nervous sweat. Then everything changed. The front door opened at exactly 7:45, and the entire restaurant seemed to inhale collectively. Vincent Torino stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding every eye in the room. At 53, he was exactly what Hollywood would cast as a mob boss. Perfectly tailored charcoal suit, silver hair slicked back, and eyes that missed nothing. But tonight, those calculating eyes held something softer as he gently guided an elderly man through the entrance. The older gentleman moved slowly, aided by a simple wooden cane. His name was Antonio Torino, Vincent's 78-year-old father. Once a powerful figure himself in the neighborhood, Antonio had gradually retreated from public life after losing his hearing 5 years earlier. The proud man who had once commanded respect with his voice now lived in a world of frustrated silence. Giuseppe practically sprinted to the front, his hands smoothing his apron as he approached. "Mr. Torino, welcome back to Bella's. Your usual table is ready." His voice carried the particular mixture of respect and nervousness that came with serving someone of Vincent's reputation. Vincent nodded curtly, but his attention remained focused on his father, watching as the older man's eyes swept the familiar restaurant with a mixture of nostalgia and resignation. How many times had Antonio dined here in his younger years, holding court with associates, celebrating family milestones, living fully in a world he could hear? They were seated at table 12, a corner booth that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entire dining room. Giuseppe personally presented the menus, speaking directly to Vincent while Antonio sat quietly, his weathered hands folded on the white tablecloth. "Who's covering that section tonight?" Vincent asked, his tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent that made Giuseppe's spine straighten. "Maria, sir. She's relatively new but very capable. I can personally handle your table if you prefer." "No," Vincent's response was quick. Let her serve us, but make sure she understands the importance of discretion. Giuseppe nodded rapidly. Of course, Mr. Torino. Absolutely. Across the dining room, Maria had been watching the arrival with the same fascination as every other staff member. She'd heard whispers about Vincent Torino. Everyone in the neighborhood had. But seeing him in person, witnessing the gentle way he cared for his elderly father, created a more complex picture than the street rumors suggested. Table 12 is yours! Giuseppe appeared at her elbow, his voice low and urgent. The Torinos, be polite, be professional, and whatever you do, don't ask questions. Just serve them well and everything will be fine. Maria felt her heart rate spike. This was easily the most important table she'd ever been assigned. As she gathered menus and water glasses, her hands began their familiar tremor, the same nervous shake that had plagued her since childhood, whenever attention focused on her. She approached the table with careful steps, her eyes fixed on her notepad to avoid direct eye contact with Vincent. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Bella's. Can I start you with some water? Vincent looked up, studying this young waitress who seemed to be concentrating very hard on not looking directly at him. There was something refreshing about her obvious nervousness. Most people either cowered in fear or tried too hard to impress him. This girl was simply trying to do her job well. Water's fine. And bring us your wine list. His voice was surprisingly gentle, lacking the edge she'd expected. Maria nodded, pouring water with hands that only shook slightly. As she set down Antonio's glass, she noticed something that made her pause. The elderly man was watching her movements with intense focus, his eyes tracking her hands with the particular attention of someone who relied heavily on visual cues. More than that, she recognized something in his expression, the slight isolation that came from being surrounded by conversation you couldn't join, the polite smile that masked frustration, the way he sat just slightly apart from the interaction, waiting for someone to remember to include him. It was the same expression she'd seen on her brother's face countless times. Without thinking, Maria set down the water pitcher and looked directly at Antonio. Her hands moved slowly, carefully forming the signs. Good evening, sir. Are you comfortable? Can I get you anything special? The reaction was immediate and profound. Antonio's entire face transformed. His eyes widened, then filled with tears that threatened to spill over. His mouth opened slightly in surprise, and his own hands began to move, rusty from disuse but still fluent. You can sign? Yes, sir. My brother is deaf. I've been signing since I was 8 years old. The conversation that followed happened entirely in silence, but every person in the restaurant could feel its power. Antonio's hands moved with increasing confidence, years of pent-up communication flowing through his fingers. Maria responded with patience and genuine warmth, her earlier nervousness completely forgotten. Vincent sat frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold. When was the last time he'd seen his father truly communicate with someone outside the family? When was the last time the old man's face had shown such pure joy? The other diners had begun to notice. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter as people realized something extraordinary was happening at table 12. Even the kitchen staff had found reasons to peer through the service window. Antonio's hands moved faster now, telling Maria about his life before the silence took over. How he used to run the neighborhood bakery. How he loved listening to opera while kneading dough. How music had been everything to him until the day it all disappeared. His signs were elegant, practiced, carrying decades of stories that had been locked away. Maria listened with her eyes, responding with gentle questions that drew out more memories. She asked about his favorite recipes, his proudest moments, the songs he missed most. For the first time in years, Antonio wasn't just existing in conversations, he was leading them. Vincent watched his father come alive in a way he hadn't seen since before the hearing loss. The old man's posture had straightened, his eyes sparkled with engagement, and his hands danced through the air with renewed purpose. It was like watching someone wake up from a long sleep. But what struck Vincent most was the waitress herself. This shy girl who had seemed ready to disappear into the wallpaper was now completely transformed. Her nervousness had vanished, replaced by confident, flowing movements as she signed. She leaned in when Antonio told funny stories, her face lighting up with genuine laughter at his silent jokes. Other staff members had begun to gather at a respectful distance, pretending to clean nearby tables while watching this unprecedented scene. Giuseppe stood by the kitchen door, wringing his hands with nervous energy. He'd never seen anything like this in 40 years of restaurant service. "What's he saying?" Vincent finally asked, his voice rougher than usual. Maria turned to him, her face flushed with the joy of connection. "He's telling me about the time you were 7 and tried to help him make bread. Apparently you used salt instead of sugar and insisted the customers would love it anyway." Vincent's expression softened, a rare smile crossing his features. "He still brings that up. I nearly poisoned half the neighborhood. He says you were so confident about it." Maria continued, her hands still moving as Antonio added more details. "You stood behind the counter telling everyone it was a new recipe you invented. Even when Mrs. Castellano spit it out, you insisted she just didn't understand sophisticated flavors." For the first time in years, Vincent heard his father laugh. Not the polite chuckle he'd grown accustomed to, but the deep belly laugh that had filled their house when Vincent was a child. The sound drew stares from across the restaurant, but Vincent didn't care. He couldn't remember the last time his father had seemed this happy. Antonio's hands slowed as he shared a more serious memory. Maria's expression grew tender as she interpreted. "He says those were the best days of his life. Working alongside you, teaching you the business, watching you grow into a man. He wishes he could still hear your voice." Vincent's throat tightened. "Tell him I wish I could give that back to him." Maria signed Vincent's words, and Antonio reached across the table to squeeze his son's hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried years of unspoken love and regret. The evening took on a dreamlike quality. Other diners found themselves drawn into the story unfolding at table 12, though they only caught fragments of the conversation. They saw the elderly man's animated expressions, the waitress's patient responses, and the tough-looking man in the expensive suit wiping his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Giuseppe finally approached the table, his usual nervousness replaced by genuine curiosity. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've never seen anything quite like this. Maria, I had no idea you could sign." "I never mentioned it," Maria replied quietly. "It was just something I learned for my family. She's been telling me about the old neighborhood," Antonio signed, with Maria translating. "About how the restaurant has kept all the same recipes from when I used to supply the bread. She says you still make the veal the way my wife taught your mother." Giuseppe's eyes widened. "You remember my mother learning from Mrs. Torino? That was 30 years ago." "He remembers everything," Vincent said, his voice carrying a mix of pride and sadness. "He just hasn't had anyone to share the memories with." The conversation continued as their dinner arrived, but the food became secondary to the connection happening across the table. Antonio shared stories about the neighborhood's history, about families who had come and gone, about traditions that had been passed down through generations. Maria absorbed every detail, asking questions that showed she truly cared about his experiences. As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Other diners started approaching the table, not to bother Vincent, but to greet Antonio. Word had somehow spread that the old man could communicate again, and people who had known him for decades came to say hello. Mrs. Benedetto, who had been eating dinner with her daughter, stopped by to thank Antonio for always giving her family extra bread during hard times. A young man named Tony introduced himself as the grandson of Antonio's old friend from the docks. Each interaction was facilitated by Maria, who translated with growing confidence and obvious joy. Vincent watched in amazement as his father became the center of attention in the most positive way. For years, people had whispered around Antonio, speaking about him rather than to him. Tonight, he was once again the respected community elder he had always been. sharing wisdom and stories with anyone who wanted to listen. "How does it feel?" Maria signed to Antonio during a brief lull in the parade of visitors. "Like coming home," he replied, his hands steady and sure. "I had forgotten what it was like to be heard." The simple statement hit Maria deeply. She understood the isolation, the frustration, the gradual withdrawal from a world that seemed to have no place for you. But she also understood the incredible power of being truly seen and understood by another person. Vincent leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "I need to ask you something, and please be honest. Would you consider spending time with my father regularly? Not as a waitress, but as someone who can talk with him. I'll pay you whatever you ask." Maria looked between father and son, seeing the hope in both their faces. "Mr. Torino, I don't need payment for friendship. If your father would like someone to visit and talk with, I'd be honored." Antonio's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "She would do that? Really? I have 2 days off each week," Maria explained. "I could come by your home, or meet here, or wherever you're comfortable. We could talk about anything you want." The arrangement was settled with handshakes and promises, but the evening was far from over. As the evening drew to a close, something unexpected happened that would cement this night in everyone's memory forever. A young boy, no more than 10 years old, approached the table with his grandmother. The child had been watching the signed conversations all evening, his eyes wide with fascination. "Excuse me," the grandmother said softly to Maria. "My grandson has been learning sign language at school. He's been practicing for months, but he's never met anyone else who could sign. Would it be okay if he tried to introduce himself?" Maria looked to Antonio, whose face immediately brightened with encouragement. The old man straightened in his chair, preparing to meet this young student. The boy stepped forward, his small hands moving carefully through the alphabet as he spelled out his name. "Hisnameisdaniel." Antonio's eyes sparkled with delight. He responded slowly, his signs clear and patient. "Hello, Daniel. You sign very well for someone so young. How long have you been learning?" The boy's face lit up as he understood. His response was slower, more hesitant, but determined. 6 months. My teacher says practice makes perfect." "Your teacher is very wise," Antonio signed back. "Would you like me to teach you some Italian signs? They're a little different from American ones." What followed was an impromptu lesson that drew the attention of the entire restaurant. Antonio taught Daniel how to sign basic Italian greetings, food words, and family terms. The boy absorbed everything with the eager enthusiasm only children possess, while his grandmother watched with tears in her eyes. "I've never seen him so excited about learning," she whispered to Maria. "He's been struggling with confidence in his classes, but look at him now." Maria watched as Antonio patiently corrected Daniel's hand positions, showing him how to make each sign clearer and more precise. The old man had transformed from isolated dinner guest to beloved teacher, his years of experience and wisdom finally finding an outlet. Vincent observed this scene with growing amazement. His father, who had withdrawn from social situations for years, was now holding court with half the restaurant watching. The shy, nervous waitress had somehow unlocked something in the old man that Vincent had thought was lost forever. "Papa," Vincent said, touching his father's arm gently, "we should probably head home soon." Antonio nodded but continued his lesson for a few more minutes, teaching Daniel how to sign thank you and goodbye in both American and Italian Sign Language. When they finally finished, the boy ran back to his grandmother, his hands moving excitedly as he showed off his new vocabulary. The restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause. It started with Giuseppe, who had been watching from behind the bar, and spread to every table in the dining room. People who had been strangers an hour earlier were now clapping for this unlikely trio who had created something beautiful together. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at the attention, but Antonio stood and took a small bow, his face beaming with pride and joy. Vincent rose beside his father, placing a protective hand on the old man's shoulder, but his expression showed nothing but admiration for what had just transpired. "This is the most incredible thing I've witnessed in 40 years of running this restaurant," Giuseppe announced to the room. "Tonight, we've all learned something about the power of communication, compassion, and human connection." As the applause died down, Vincent pulled out his wallet to settle the bill, but Giuseppe waved him away. "No charge tonight, Mr. Torino. What happened here was worth more than any payment." Vincent looked like he might argue, but his father placed a gentle hand on his arm and signed something that made Maria smile. "He says that some gifts are too precious to put a price on," she translated. The three of them walked toward the exit together, but their departure was anything but quick. Nearly every person in the restaurant stopped them to say goodbye to Antonio, to shake Maria's hand, or to simply express how moved they had been by what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Benedetto pressed a small piece of paper into Maria's hand. "My number," she explained. "I have a deaf nephew in Brooklyn who never comes to family gatherings anymore. Maybe you could help us learn to talk with him?" A middle-aged businessman approached Vincent directly. "My daughter lost her hearing in an accident last year. We've been struggling to connect with her. Could your friend here recommend where we might learn to sign?" Maria found herself exchanging contact information with several families, promising to help connect them with resources and possibly even provide some basic lessons. What had started as a simple dinner service had evolved into something that would impact the entire community. Outside the restaurant, Vincent helped his father into the passenger seat of his sleek black sedan. But before getting behind the wheel, he turned to Maria, who was preparing to catch the subway home. "I meant what I said earlier about visiting my father," Vincent said, his voice carrying an emotion she'd never expected to hear from someone with his reputation. "But I want you to understand something. What you did tonight, it wasn't just kindness. You gave my father his voice back. You gave him his dignity back. That's not something I can ever repay." Maria shook her head. "Mr. Torino, you don't understand. Your father gave me something tonight too. I've spent my whole life feeling invisible, like my skills didn't matter to anyone outside my family. Tonight, I felt useful. I felt like I made a real difference." Antonio rolled down the window and signed to both of them. "Stop talking about payment and debt. Tonight was about family, and now we're family. That's how these things work." Vincent translated for Maria, then added his own thoughts. "My father has always been wise about people. If he says you're family, then you're family. And in our family, we take care of each other." The weight of that statement settled over Maria like a warm blanket. For someone who had spent years feeling like an outsider, the idea of belonging to something larger than herself was both thrilling and terrifying. "There's something else," Vincent continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I want you to have this." He handed her a small business card with just a phone number printed on it. "If you ever need anything at all, you call that number, day or night. And I mean anything, Maria. Job troubles, family problems, someone bothering you, whatever. You're under our protection now." Maria stared at the card, understanding the significance of what he was offering. In this neighborhood, having Vincent Torino's protection was like having an invisible shield around you. But more than that, it was a symbol of acceptance into a world that few outsiders ever entered. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll come visit Papa on Thursday afternoon. He's already planning what stories he wants to share with you." Maria smiled, tucking the card carefully into her purse. "I'll be there. Should I bring anything?" Antonio signed something from the car, and Vincent chuckled. "He says bring an appetite. He wants to cook for you. Apparently, he's been saving his grandmother's secret recipe for someone special enough to deserve it." As Vincent drove away, Maria stood on the sidewalk watching the taillights disappear into the night. The street looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but everything felt different. She felt different. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "How was work tonight, sis?" Maria looked back at Bella's Ristorante, where Giuseppe was still visible through the windows, animatedly retelling the evening's events to the remaining staff. She thought about Antonio's joyful expressions, Vincent's unexpected vulnerability, and the way an entire restaurant had been transformed by something as simple as moving your hands in the right way. Tonight, she typed back. Everything changed, but she had no idea just how much her life was about to transform. Thursday afternoon was only 2 days away, and with it would come discoveries that would challenge everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and the true meaning of belonging to something bigger than yourself. The shy waitress who had trembled while serving water just hours earlier was gone. In her place stood someone who had found her purpose, her people, and her place in a story that was just beginning to unfold. As Maria finally headed toward the subway, she didn't notice the black car that had pulled up across the street, or the man inside taking photos with a long lens camera. She didn't see him make a phone call or hear him report that Vincent Torino had just made a very interesting new friend. Some people had been watching the Torino family for years, waiting for any sign of weakness or change in routine, and tonight, they had witnessed something unprecedented. The most feared man in Little Italy showing genuine emotion in public, all because of one young waitress who could move her hands like poetry. The game was about to change in ways no one could predict, and Maria Santos was now right in the center of it all. The photographs would surface 3 days later, but Maria had no way of knowing that Thursday afternoon as she stood outside the modest brownstone on Mulberry Street. Her hands clutched a small bag containing homemade cookies her mother had insisted she bring, along with the Italian-English dictionary she'd borrowed from the library. Vincent answered the door himself, which surprised her. She'd expected staff, bodyguards, the typical entourage that surrounded powerful men. Instead, there was just Vincent in casual slacks and a sweater, looking more like someone's uncle than the feared figure from Tuesday night. "He's been waiting for you since noon," Vincent said, his voice carrying warmth she was still getting used to. "I haven't seen him this excited about anything in years." The house was nothing like what Maria had imagined. Yes, it was beautifully furnished with obvious attention to quality, but it felt like a home. Family photographs lined the hallway. The scent of fresh bread filled the air, and she could hear opera playing softly from the kitchen. Antonio appeared in the doorway, flour dusting his hands and a genuine smile lighting up his weathered face. His hands moved immediately. "Maria, perfect timing. I'm just finishing the bread. Come, you must tell me what you think." The next 3 hours passed like minutes. Antonio had indeed been saving his grandmother's recipe, a complex pasta dish that required precise timing and techniques passed down through generations. As they cooked together, he shared stories about his childhood in Sicily, his immigration to America, and the early days of building a life in Little Italy. Maria found herself completely absorbed in his tales. Through her hands, Antonio painted pictures of a world long gone, of traditions that lived now only in memory, of the weight of carrying family legacy forward through generations. His signs were elegant, expressive, carrying emotions that transcended language barriers. Vincent was always impatient in the kitchen, Antonio signed, laughing as he demonstrated the proper way to fold the pasta. Even as a boy, he wanted everything done quickly. But good food, like good life, cannot be rushed. What was he like as a child? Maria asked, genuinely curious about this glimpse into Vincent's past. Antonio's expression grew tender as he shared memories of his son, the boy who brought home stray animals, who defended smaller children from bullies, who cried when he accidentally stepped on a spider. It was a side of Vincent that seemed impossible to reconcile with his current reputation. People change, Antonio signed, his hands moving more slowly now. Life forces us to become things we never planned to be, but underneath, the heart remains the same. Vincent is still that boy who cannot stand to see others suffer. Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Vincent appeared, but his demeanor had shifted completely. The relaxed man from earlier was gone, replaced by someone alert, calculating, dangerous. "Papa, take Maria to the back room," Vincent said, his voice carrying an authority that made Antonio immediately comply. Now, Maria felt her stomach drop as she recognized the tone. This wasn't a social visit. This was business. the kind that had nothing to do with bread recipes and childhood stories. Through the kitchen window, she could see men in expensive suits gathering in the front yard. Their posture, their watchful eyes, everything about them screamed law enforcement. But there was something else, something that made Vincent's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. "Federal agents," Antonio signed, his hands steady despite the obvious tension. "They come sometimes. Usually they find nothing and leave, but this time felt different." Maria could hear raised voices from the front of the house, demands being made, papers being presented. Vincent's responses were controlled but sharp, each word carefully chosen. Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI had been tracking the Torino family for 18 months. She'd built her career on taking down organized crime families, and Vincent Torino represented the biggest prize of her tenure. But every investigation had hit dead ends. Every witness had suddenly developed amnesia. Every lead had evaporated like morning mist until Tuesday night. The photographs spread across her desk told a story she'd never expected to find. Vincent Torino, the man who never showed emotion in public, whose every action was calculated for maximum intimidation, caught in a moment of pure vulnerability. And the catalyst was a young waitress, whose background check had revealed something interesting. "Maria Santos," Agent Martinez said to her partner as they approached the brownstone. 22 years old, born in Queens, clean record. But here's what's fascinating. Her younger brother Carlos is involved with the Castellano crew. Small-time stuff, but it's a connection. What Agent Martinez didn't know was that Carlos Santos had been trying to get out of that world for months. What she couldn't have predicted was that Maria's connection to Vincent had nothing to do with criminal enterprises and everything to do with something far more powerful than business arrangements. Inside the house, Maria pressed against the kitchen wall, her heart hammering as she listened to the confrontation escalating in the front room. Antonio sat calmly at the kitchen table, his hands folded, but his eyes held a steel she'd never seen before. "They want to know about you," he signed to Maria, his expression grave. "Someone has been watching, taking pictures. They think you're involved in Vincent's business. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying." Maria, who had never even received a parking ticket, who volunteered at her church every Sunday, who sent half her paycheck home to help her mother pay rent, was now apparently a person of interest in a federal investigation. "I should leave," she signed, starting to stand. Antonio's hand shot out, gentle but firm on her wrist. "No. Running makes you look guilty. Staying shows you have nothing to hide." The agents left empty-handed that afternoon, but they left behind something far more valuable than any evidence they might have found. They left behind the confirmation that sometimes the most powerful connections aren't built on fear or obligation, but on something much simpler: the willingness to see another person's pain and respond with kindness. Maria continued visiting Antonio every Thursday, and their friendship blossomed into something neither had expected. She taught him new signs she'd learned. He shared recipes that had been in his family for generations. Vincent watched his father come alive week after week, and slowly began to understand that true strength wasn't about inspiring fear, but about protecting the people who mattered most. The shy waitress had walked into that restaurant thinking she was just serving dinner. Instead, she discovered that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes. A simple conversation in sign language didn't just give an old man his voice back. It reminded everyone in that room that connection transcends every barrier we think divides us. So the next time you see someone sitting alone, someone who seems invisible to the world around them, remember Maria and Antonio. Remember that your smallest act of kindness might be exactly what someone needs to feel human again. Because in a world that often rewards toughness over tenderness, choosing compassion will always be the most powerful thing you can do.